All right. Welcome. Here to talk about liability for mental health clinicians, specifically, maybe some information about insurance and what would be helpful for y'all. If you have questions or thoughts, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. I see there must be a couple of folks here. Um, the reason that I started this was just looking at the new report that comes out from the ACA and CNA insurance companies and HPSO, their third edition of their report around counselors and liability. So I thought this might be helpful for a lot of us, figure out like what are the trends right now with regards to liability, and then of course what can we do about it. If you're subscribed, then you should be able to send chats and questions. If you're not subscribed, feel free to put those in an email to us. That information's down in the description below, but I'll also put it in the chat. Yeah, so you can always email us if for any reason the chat doesn't work. It is delayed just to kind of keep bots and things from popping up and asking random questions. I haven't introduced myself. I'm Dana Sia, pronouns she, they. I was an insurance agent turned licensed mental health clinician. So a bit of my background is really connected with this topic around liability for us as clinicians. Just know that today I'm not speaking to you as your insurance agent, which is actually one of the terms I wanted to talk about today. It is a bit different than just a representative, but an actual licensed insurance agent. So I'm not that for you today, unfortunately. Definitely reach out to your company where you have your insurance to ask them any specific questions about your coverage, about potential claims, things like that, or maybe if you want to expand on what we talk about today, please do that. And also, I'm not your supervisor right now either, but if you have a supervisor, that could be a good place to go and talk through what ifs. So, what if this happens? What if this happens? What should I do? Or how do I get prepared before it happens? So, that overlap between that true like legal insight from an insurance agent and then more of our field insights from supervisors or colleagues, whatever that might look like. So, in the third edition from the report that came out, they were comparing some of the data from their 2019 data set and their 2024 data set. So, for 2024, these were claims that were closed, meaning they were finished, they had been paid out, there's no more litigation, and it was closed between early 2018 and late 2023. And those claims could have started years before, they could have started months before, but those are all the claims that were closed in between those years. The average total incurred for professional liability claims was over $150,000. And that is an increase of almost 40% from what we saw in the 2019 data. So we are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, and probably in some cases even more than that, with just one particular claim. Most of you are going to see that your liability insurance has limits around like maybe 1 million, 3 million, something like that. And I'll talk to you about what the differences in those types mean, like per claim and aggregate stuff like that. There was also an increase in the number of claims that had a paid amount that was greater than or equal to $500,000. That seems like a lot. It's hard to comprehend, like how would a claim happen that would be $500,000 or more, but it did increase. 7% of claims were $500,000 or more. And this is money that was paid on behalf of an insured counselor in the settlement or judgment of the claim. So maybe trying to settle it outside of court or because of the judgment that was made in court. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those two as well. For those of us who are in private practice, know that the percentage of claims related to private practice increased from about 10% to almost 22%. It makes sense. A lot of us are going into private practice, so there's maybe a greater likelihood that claims would occur in private practice, but that is something to just be aware of, even if we feel like, oh, we're too small for something like this to happen. In private practice, those claims were increasing. They also looked at what was considered telehealth, so something outside the quote traditional office setting, anything using virtual technology. And this was about 4% of claims for the 2024 report, which there were none in the 2019 report. So gives you an idea. 4% may not seem like a lot, but 4% compared to zero is a pretty big increase. What was even more surprising for me is the claims that were related to virtual technology had an average total incurred cost of over $300,000. So it sounds like there are some that are maybe weighted higher. We're talking 300,000, 500,000, but maybe the majority of them are actually much smaller than that, given that the average is a little over 150,000. They looked at claims that directly mapped onto the ACA Code of Ethics, and the majority of them were based on violations of the counseling relationship. This was the top category in both the 2019 and the 2024 data sets. And the one thing I think we can all agree on within our field, the sexual or romantic relationships with clients, that was the greatest number of claims. So 38% of claims with any paid amount greater than $1 were related to sexual and or romantic relationships with clients. These claims had an average total of over $100,000. So just kind of keep in mind why that is so important for us as counselors. The next category was related to supervision, training, and teaching. That increased from 13 to 18%, and the total paid out increased from over 80,000 to 160,000 or more. Evaluation, assessment, and interpretation also increased from just about 3% to almost 10% of all claims, and the average total paid for those also increased from only like $25,000 to over $460,000. That is what I saw as like the biggest increase in the amount paid out. So the number of claims increased, but the average paid from 25,000 to 460,000, that's a big, big difference. And also shows where some of those larger sums paid out for claims might have ended up. So evaluation, assessment, interpretation. We talk often about subpoenas and court orders. There is assistance that you can add to your insurance related to subpoenas, and those matters were about 66% of all closed with payment. So know that there is coverage that you can get for subpoenas, that your insurance company will back you up. I hear mixed reviews about which insurance companies are better than that at that. But just know that there's a large percent of claims that are related to subpoenas and that they do end up with some sort of payment. The majority of the license protection matters, so these would be related to your board, close with no action taken by the board, which is showing that there's some sort of successful defense of the insured counselor. So just to repeat that maybe in a little bit more layman's terms, if you're brought a complaint against you with the board, meaning it doesn't go to court, it is just with your board, there is a protection for that called the license protection coverage. Make sure that your policy has that in it. The majority of those closed with no action taken by the board. There are many reasons for that we can probably think of as far as like management techniques that people had put into place that would help whenever that complaint came in. So some examples here. Appropriate communication with clients and colleagues, thorough documentation, starting with that initial session, the assessment process, treatment plan, all of your progress notes, and including any communication that is done in between sessions. I think we often kind of brush off like text messages or phone calls or emails, but all of those should be documented as well to help with our risk management. Well documented informed consent is really important. So making sure that like professional disclosure statements gone over, our practice policies, and that we document those discussions and any questions that clients have. Detailed client assessment. We talked about the very large sums that were paid out related to assessment. So it's important that these are detailed and thorough. Adherence to state licensing regulations and laws. Those are examples that often come up, that where each state is very different. We're talking about the counseling compact, which I think is going to be great. It's going to increase the access for clients to us. The problem is for every state that we are licensed with or that we've got that reciprocity with, we need to know those specific regulations and laws. And then, of course, the compliance with the ACA Code of Ethics. And this can really come down to ethical decision making before something happens or before you make a decision, rather than using that to justify it after the fact. So you had asked, it is license protection coverage in your policy is what would help with all of those. So if something goes up against your board regarding your license, that is the license protection coverage that will help you out. The cost of those, of course, the cost of those claims did remain pretty steady. There's a little bit of an increase, but it was right around $5,500 for both the 2019 data set and the 2024 data set. Both of those per instance, an average of about $5,500. I don't typically have $5,500 laying around to help me with a license matter with my board. So having the insurance to cover that is going to be really, really helpful, and something to just keep in mind in general when we're talking about insurance. If you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars in a bank account somewhere that you can pull on for any sort of claim, that's great. If you don't, or if you're worried about a claim costing more than that, then insurance is going to be the way to go to help with that. The premiums can seem steep at times, so definitely shop around, but remember, you want to have a company that you feel like you've got a good relationship with if and when something does happen. I talked a little bit about board complaints just now, and that can primarily come from like ethical violations. The other piece of this is our malpractice claims. And I think we often conflate the two, which they can be. They can both be the same thing. But just know that for our field, there can be a big difference between a board complaint and then a malpractice claim where it's actually taken into court. And this is not determined solely by the behavior of the counselor or whatever happened to cause this claim. It's determined on whether or not the complaint is brought to that regulatory board or civil court. The same one can be brought to both, but in general, there are greater numbers of board complaints than there are lawsuits, which should be a little comforting for us. Some of the top 10 license protection allegations that happened, I've mentioned a few of these, but just want to go through. Sexual misconduct was first and foremost, failure to maintain professional standards, breach of confidentiality, which I think with things being kept virtually, online, or having virtual appointments, that can increase the risk of confidentiality that we might not otherwise think of. Reporting to third parties, this often includes insurance companies. Failure to practice within the boundaries of competence. This is in our code of ethics, but is also really important to our board as well. Some of the cases that I looked at, for example, there was a practitioner who was writing reports out for like a government entity. So clients would come to them, do an assessment, write up the report, send it to the government entity. And eventually, the government entity found out that this counselor was claiming to be a psychologist when they were not, in fact, a psychologist. So that's similar here. Failure to accurately present qualifications or credentials, there you go, leads right into that. So, what's the competence? What's our training? But also, are we accurately representing our qualifications or credentials? One of the ones that I found was someone who had noted a doctorate in environmental sciences or something like that on their documentation related to clinical work. And obviously, those things are very, very different. So the board's issue in that case was that yeah, they had a doctorate, but it wasn't in the field, so it should not have been included on like marketing, included in documentation, consents, things like that. Abandonment of clients, fraudulent billing. This is also one I give the example of if you are speeding and you get caught for speeding, but then they also find out you're not wearing a seatbelt and your registration and license are expired. You could have just gotten away with the speeding ticket, but now they're finding out, oh, look, you're not wearing a seatbelt. Your license is expired. Your registration is expired. So it's like adding on to this. Fraudulent billing can be the same. So if someone is fraudulently billing Medicaid, for example, and Medicaid finds an issue and goes back and works within the fraud area, they might also find that this person wasn't keeping treatment plans or progress notes. So that can be a snowball effect. Failure to observe parental or familial rights to make decisions on behalf of minor clients. And this, of course, is very state specific. Every state has laws generally around that. So look into getting legal advice if you have questions around treating minors and who should or should not be included in that treatment or given access to records, things like that. Violation of professional boundaries and the poor relationships like non-sexual boundary violations. So the opposite of where we started with the sexual romantic boundary violations. This is more so professional or just having poor relationships. Some of the cases that I have seen are counselors who invite clients in to live with them, or they might be paying for certain things for them, like somewhere to live or for their taxis or things like that. And again, that snowballs, right? It rarely does it go from like 0 to 100 right at the same time. We're talking about little things that add up over time that lead to these boundary violations. We've got different types of liability coverage that I wanted to explain because these are what I often see in social media groups around like if this happened what coverage would I need or will this coverage protect this, and I think there's a lot of confusion and rightfully so because they're very vaguely named. So I wanted to make sure we understood the different types of liability coverage. The first one, and this is especially true if you have a private practice, the first one you may see is general liability. This would protect your practice if there are third party claims related to property damage or injury that come up on your property, not necessarily related to your professional duties, but it might be something like a someone trips and falls on a rug, something like that would fall under general liability. So that's not something you necessarily did in the course of treatment. This was just them walking around your building and they tripped and fall. It may not even be a client. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are a tenant, this might also be really important. if there is something that happens in the building, even though you don't own it, you're renting the space. If you have that general liability, don't ever solely rely on a boss or a manager or the owner or anything like that to have all the coverage, because you also can be pulled into a suit for any reason, and the general liability could help with that, if there's an issue with your landlord or any injury damages. Professional liability is what we often think of within our role as counselors. This is going to protect you if there is some sort of, and it doesn't have to be true, it can just be alleged error that you had committed as a part of your duties, and that also resulted in some sort of damage or harm. Malpractice claims often do include physical injury, but it can be around violating their rights. It can be around verbal abuse, just general unprofessional conduct. All of those can fall under professional liability. Under that, you might look into adding, if you don't already have it, HIPAA proceedings, which can be a supplementary benefit, meaning you would add it on by endorsement, which I'll talk about endorsement here in a minute. But this HIPAA provision could reimburse you up to a certain amount, if for some reason you were to breach confidentiality related to HIPAA, and you have to then let all of the clients know. So it would help cover that communication. It would help cover any fines or penalties that you might incur because of that. Um, some states may not have that coverage, so just be aware of it. But that is a coverage you could add on to your policy. I talked earlier about the subpoena assistance. This is something that you can add on, subpoena assistance. So if you receive a subpoena for documents or testimony as a result of your professional duties, or that are related to a lawsuit where you're not even named, your insurance company can help with that. They can help you with representation, so communication, responding to the subpoena, prepping you for court. Any of those attorney fees are going to be covered by that specific supplemental insurance. Defense costs. So keep in mind, if you have a claim and maybe you lose or you win, this would help cover any of those defense costs. Also helps with the investigation of the claims and any costs that go into that. Um, Usually this is separate from your liability limits, because your liability is what gets paid directly to the person who was harmed. The defense is a cost of you literally being defended as a result of this. And then I also mentioned the licensed defense expenses coverage that you can add. So if there's a complaint submitted to your board or any other licensing agency that you're a part of, like if you have a certificate of some sort, they could help with that. And it could be reimbursement, or it can be paying up front for some of those costs, depending upon your policy. Cyber liability coverage is one that I think a lot of folks get wrong, unfortunately, because it's super important for our field. And it's not about covering us during telehealth sessions. Would be nice if it was, but that's not the case. That would probably fall more so under professional liability, because those are whatever duties you're carrying out during that telehealth appointment or the telehealth services, if it's like texts and emails. Cyber liability is going to cover you if you are electronically storing any records. So this would be that EHR that you have, any of your like OneDrive or Google Drive that you use, anything that is essentially stored in some sort of cloud, it's not physically stored anywhere, then that is going to fall under the cyber liability coverage. Um, Let me make sure I have the information. So it doesn't matter if you are providing services in person or online, it will still cover that EHR data, that OneDrive or Google Drive data. anything that is stored in that cloud, regardless of where the actual services take place. If you have a data breach for any reason and they get access to that data, then you have a lot of steps that you actually have to take to protect yourself, to protect clients. If they are extorting you, like they're saying, I'm not going to let you back in until you pay X amount, cyber liability can help cover that to get you back into your accounts and get that data back. If you lose some of the data, then this coverage can also help with that. If there's any income lost during that time, this coverage can help with any of that, the disruption that you experienced. When you contact clients, and this has likely happened to you at some point if you have done anything with like a credit card or even like a job application. This happened to me one time. So all that information is often stored somewhere in a cloud. And if that gets hacked, they have to contact everyone whose data was hacked. So you've likely received some sort of letter in the mail or an email that says, hey, by the way, you applied for this job. I think I applied for like an Old Navy job way back when, like 2010 or something. And they're like, hey, by the way, your data was a part of this breach that we had. We have to let you know. And if you'd like, here is some like credit report tracking that we've paid for you. And you can go in there and you can use this benefit. So cyber liability would also help cover that. Any of the benefits you maybe needed to provide to clients whose data was hacked. That credit report tracking is really important in those instances. Property coverage. This is going to be direct loss or damage to your property or to your premise, to your building. Of course, it has to be with a covered event. So if it is a fire, for example, this is a really common one, then that would most likely be a covered event. If it was a flood, this is something you're going to want to talk to your insurance agent about because usually that is not added into that coverage. So definitely talk to them. But for property coverage, think about your own property and what would happen if it was damaged. But also think about what if you damage someone else's property, like if you are renting a space, for example, or renting a computer and you damage it, then that coverage may also help to cover those damages as well. Business interruption protection can help. This might be if you are injured, you're ill, you can't work, maybe your electricity goes out for several days or your internet goes down and you can't use the services you typically would to meet clients, then business interruption can help kick in. Usually there's, instead of like a dollar amount deductible, there's usually an hour type of deductible. So after 24 hours or 48 hours, that business interruption protection will kick in and start to help you with any potential lost income. For this protection, it's really important to have a good record of kind of your typical weekly or monthly income so that they can get some sort of estimate of what you might have lost during that time to help cover you for that. Workers' compensation is for your employees. So if you have employees and the staff are hurt while performing their typical job related duties, or if they're just hurt while on your practice's location, like in your building, this can help provide protection for them and also for you with any damages that occur, like money that you need to pay out for that related to medical costs. In some states, this is mandatory, especially if you hit a certain amount of employees, like you have 3, 5, 15, or more employees, they require you to have workers' comp. So if you are a business owner, just make sure that you're aware of your own state laws and when that requirement for workers' compensation would kick in. Some additional add-on coverages that you can get. So preceding expense reimbursement. can help to reimburse you up to a certain amount per day or annually for lost wages and other expenses you might incur when you're required to attend a trial, a hearing, or a proceeding as a defendant in a covered claim. So if you have a claim brought against you and you are trying to defend yourself, then they will help to pay a certain up to a certain amount per day, or per year in those instances while you're out of work, or any other expenses that you might incur, likely traveling, things like that. There's assault coverage. So if you are assaulted by a client, or you are assaulted while going to or from your workplace, this coverage can help kick in to reimburse costs related to that, like medical expenses or damage to your property. Some states this coverage is not available, so just be aware of that. But if you are working in a setting where you feel like this might be helpful, then assault coverage is something you could add on. Non-patient medical expenses. So this would pay to a certain amount per person or per year to reimburse any necessary medical expenses that are incurred by others who are injured on your business premises during a covered incident, other than like a medical incident. So if something happens, someone else who's not a patient gets injured for whatever reason, this type of coverage can help kick in. Personal injury. So stop thinking about like a medical injury. This is about privacy violations, slander, libel, any other personal injury related to those while carrying out your professional practices and services. The personal injury coverage can help kick in for that. So if they're noting that you have violated someone's privacy, or someone is suing you for slander or libel, something like that, then the personal injury would kick in for you. So not medical expenses, a little bit different. There's patient first aid medical expenses. So we're back to medical. This would help to reimburse you for any expenses that you incur as you're rendering first aid to others. So if you have a patient who needs you to give CPR or use some sort of IED machine or something like that, then that patient first aid medical expenses could help kick in and cover expenses related to that. Services to animals property damage, which I looked at the form itself and wasn't 100% sure why it said animals, but it does. So services to animals property damage can help pay for unintentional damage you might cause to someone else's property while at your workplace. Abuse and molestation is if you are called in for a claim of abuse or molestation against some sort of client. So, sexual misconduct. There are some limits to this. So, if you're found liable, then it may or may not kick in. It's not available in some states. It's not going to cover criminal acts. So just kind of keep in mind that this is going to kick in certain instances, but it may not kick in all instances we could think of. And media event expenses can be supplementary, and this can pay up to a certain amount per year for some fees with third party legal or public relations consultants. So if something happens, where you have had bad press coverage and you need help defending yourself with that, then the media event would help with it. It's not available in all states, so just kind of keep that in mind. And if you're not maybe as active in some of those spaces, it might not be as big of a concern. But if you are, this might be something to consider, because we know how bad reviews can come up and complaints can come up around those. So that's a lot of different add-on coverages that you can get to those kind of core types of coverages that I talked about. They may or may not apply to you. You may or may not be as worried about them. So if you want just kind of like the basics of what do I have to have, what is super important to have. Obviously, professional liability, first and foremost, is usually how your plan or your policy is built, starting with the professional liability for anything you do as a result of your professional duties. The other one that I'm going to highly recommend is that license protection. If it's not already included, you want to be able to defend yourself against any sort of claim brought to your board or any sort of agency that you're either licensed or certified with. That's going to be really important to protect because that's how you do your job, is your license or certification. Cyber liability, if you're only keeping paper records, then this might not be a big deal for you. But if you've got anything stored electronically related to client data, cyber liability is going to be super important. And it may look very expensive to add on to your policy, but I think Dana's opinion, I would argue that this is one of our greatest areas of risk right now, is potentially being hacked in any of those accounts. No, your EHR does not cover these claims. Likely, if you go back to your user services, you will see that they have some sort of provision in there that says if you are hacked, you are responsible for that. And this can happen because you use the same password in two places, or you accidentally inserted your email and password into a fake form. These are very simple ways of getting our login information that can happen to anybody, myself included. And cyber liability, if something did unfortunately happen with that data, cyber liability is going to kick into place. If you're an owner of a building, if you are employing people, then you want to look at your general liability. What coverage do you have for that? And you also want to look at workers' compensation and if you have to have that or not. So those are a couple for those of us who are employers or who have our own private practices. The general liability and the workers' comp are going to be ones that we may be legally required to have, including if you are renting like from a building space from someone. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I can keep going with like key terms. I know it's a lot to take in. Do not hesitate to put any questions in the chat or follow up with comments or concerns that you have. That's kind of my summary of what Dana's opinion would say like are the key coverages to make sure that you have. Lots of supplemental things that you can add on. It can get really confusing, but just think about where's your highest risk and then kind of go from there. And this leads me to my next section. Who, if anyone, should you talk to about this if you have concerns around what is in your policy? What do these forms mean? What kind of claim would be covered? You want to talk to a licensed insurance agent. It's not enough to call your insurance company, which I think for many of us who don't have like a local insurance agent, we just call our company like HPSO and we're like, hey, I have a question about this. Usually that person is just a representative. If you want true, like legally binding advice, you want to ask for a licensed insurance agent. Because again, you will often first be talking to a representative, just a general person. So you want to make sure you're talking to someone who is licensed and can legally interpret your forms. Know that if you have bought insurance from a national company, they will likely, if they don't have one that they can access right in that moment, they will likely need to contact you with someone who is licensed in your state. Because again, in the great United States of America, every state has its own laws, has its own rules, and the same goes for insurance. So each state is going to be different, and they will need to get you connected with a licensed agent in your state. That is really important. Yeah, so somebody asked about abandonment of clients and failure to meet professional standards. So, abandonment of clients, would be if you just stopped reaching out to them, if you stopped scheduling with them, if you needed to terminate the relationship for any reason and did not provide them with referrals. These types of instances would likely fall under abandonment of client, meaning you had a client and then you literally abandoned them in their care. Um, I think our field is more likely to be held to a higher standard related to client abandonment. So, for example, with my private practice, I'm sorry, my PCP, my primary care provider, when he's retiring, they sent me a letter and said, "Hey, your PCP is retiring. If you would like to stay with someone at our office, please call this number." That was it. They did not provide me with alternatives. They didn't contact me like directly other than via this piece of paper, literally one piece of paper. And they basically said, "Hey, by the way, he's retiring. If you want someone else, call us and we will get you connected with someone else at our office." I had an appointment within a few weeks. So I was like, I'm just going to go in and talk to him. And when I got there, then they offered me another piece of paper that had a list of other practices that were taking new clients. So that is primary care. That is not like in our field of mental health specifically. And I think it was a lot more lax versus what we would have been expected in that instance would be to contact the client to not just say, call us if you would like referrals. It's here are some referrals. The number I usually see is at least 3 types of referrals given to the client. And then, of course, from there, depending upon your relationship, if you follow up, if you help like warm contact them to the next person, it's going to depend upon your relationship with that client. But for the most part, the abandonment issues that I see with clients is that you still have some sort of relationship with them. There was no formal termination. And then it was considered abandonment because you did not terminate with them and or provide them with other resources. So another example within the termination could be if you have a client who you haven't seen for a few weeks, you reach out, they don't reach back out to you and schedule anything, you just kind of leave them like in your system. There's no termination note, there's no termination communication with the client, then that could fall under abandonment, which is why it's so important for us to have not only our own records of like, here's our policy, you didn't schedule for 3 months, so now you're considered inactive. It's not enough to just have the policy. We have to talk to them about that in the informed consent process. We need to send them communication of, hey, I haven't heard from you in 3 months. Per my policy, I'm ending services. Here are some referrals, things along those lines. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a board representative. So every situation may be interpreted differently, but that is one that could fall under abandonment potentially. Failure to meet professional standards. This is going to come back to our code of ethics. It's going to come back to any contracts that we are being held to, either by an employer or by an insurance company that we are paneled with, and then the rules and regulations by our board. So, one that I could think of is with my board, you have to have a signed supervision contract. If you're an associate level working towards your full license, you have to have a supervision contract that is not only approved by your supervisor, but is also approved by the board. And until you have that contract in place, you cannot see clients and the hours do not count. The other thing is, let's say you have a contract in place and that contract ends. Until you have a new contract in place, those hours do not count either. So that would be something where someone did not meet their professional standards because they did not have a supervision contract in place and approved by the board. One of the cases that I read over was someone who had a family member forge their supervisor's signature on their hours. So that would probably fall under the meeting professional standards, is that they forged the signature, they lied about their hours essentially. So they were not meeting the professional standards of their license type. I hope that's helpful. If you have follow-up questions to that, please let me know. But it's impossible to go over every example ever, but I think that's a really important question. Someone mentioned that they don't ever plan to have their own private practice, and they wonder if they should get supplemental insurance and what kind should they get as a worker. This is down in my list of key takeaways from today. So I'm going to go ahead and say it now. We can talk about it more later. If you are employed by someone else, have your own policy regardless. This is Dana's opinion here. um, your employer's policy is to protect them. Your policy is to protect you. If there is any sort of lawsuit brought against you, it can include you personally as well as your employer. So on the reverse side, if you're an employer, make sure you have your own coverage too, not just your professional like liability, but for your company, have that business liability in place. So I recommend every person has their own individual policy, even if they have a private practice, because that practice can have a lawsuit they can be pulled into a lawsuit, the business can be named, and then any person, any clinical, like it can be the front staff, it can be a counselor, anyone can get pulled into the lawsuit. It's so important for every single person to have their own policy. And when you have your own policy to your specific question, then you get to decide what supplemental coverages you want to have. So again, if we go back to the business has their own policy, likely there's not going to be any coverage in there to help you defend yourself against any board complaint. That's going to come from your own policy and your own supplemental coverage. If you're a supervisor, make sure that you have supervision included in your professional duties and that all of your supervisees have their own policies as well. I have a whole training on this, risk management for supervisors. If you're interested, let me know. As supervisors, we carry more risk because we have supervisees and they are doing their own things. So it's really important for us to make sure that everyone has their own policy. So it goes both ways to help hopefully answer your question. But if that doesn't answer it, feel free to let me know. And similarly, so if you have a private practice, maybe you sublet, you rent a space to other counselors, other related fields like psychology, do you need any specific coverage beyond what I shared already? Right. So you're going to want to make sure that your whoever owns the space has coverage. So if that's a business, make sure the business has coverage. If it's just you, make sure you have coverage for yourself, and there's going to be liability related to that. And then you also want to make sure that and talk to, this is likely going to be more for like a local insurance agent. If you look for independent insurance agents, they can actually go in and check different companies for different rates. And may know a little bit more about business insurance than just like another one of your, think of any of your top insurance companies that you see in commercials. You're going to look for an independent agent, and the most of the people who get their insurance from them are small restaurant owners. So if you're trying to get some recommendations, go ask the restaurant owners in your area for who they use as their insurance agent. That will likely be a pretty good referral. But yeah, you want to make sure that you have that coverage for yourself as the business, the entity, the person, but then also for your building as a whole, and then any coverages that you might need for property damage that could occur because of your renters. Anyone who comes in the building and gets injured, you want to make sure you have coverage for that. So I would just recommend looking at your policy if you already have it. And if not, talk to an insurance agent and get that policy set up as soon as possible. And then you can, as the person who is the owner of the space, who is renting to someone else, you can require that those people who are renting from you have their own policies as well. So that's something maybe to talk to your insurance agent about, like what sort of limits do you require? What sort of coverages do you require? I don't even think I have this listed here, but do you require them to name you on their policy? So there's a couple of different terms for that. But the key thing to know is if you are named on someone's policy, then that policy would help to extend to you and any like resulting liability that you might have from their actions. So this is something as an insurance agent that we almost always did, was to add that, like whoever was renting, add them to the, make sure that the make sure the owner was listed on the renter's policy. Make that very clear. So that if anything happened, they were named. Usually it's called like a named insured or additional insured. You might even have that, like if you have a mortgage on your home, or if you rent or have a loan on your car, your mortgage, the loan company, their name is likely listed on your insurance policy. And it's going to be the same for you if you're the owner of a building, that they would list your business name or whatever on their policy. The same thing can be for supervisors and supervisees. So, supervisors, you could require your supervisees to list your name on their policy, and that might help cover you if there was anything that your supervisee did and then you got pulled into it as a supervisor. Um, that is that often happens. I talk about that at length in that risk management for supervisors, about how supervisors can get pulled into supervisees' claims. Even if you didn't know what was happening, you can still be held liable for some of that. Doesn't mean it's right, you know. It doesn't mean that it'll work and it'll go through the court process and that you'll actually be held legally liable, but you can still be a named defendant in that case. If you have questions or if that didn't answer it, feel free to put that in the chat. I know some of that, the chatting is delayed. So, and there's no rush either. Like I'll be here for a little while longer. I realize we're coming up on an hour. Leave whenever you need to. I'm scheduled for to be here for another 30 minutes or so. So if you think of anything, send it there. I don't see any emails. If you do have emails, you've got our email address. You can send it that way if the chat's not working for any reason. All right. So just a reminder, when you're having these discussions, in order for that discussion to be like legally binding, so to speak, you want to make sure you're talking to a licensed insurance agent who is licensed in your state. If you have multiple state, your own state licenses, then you want to make sure you've talked to insurance agents who cover all of those states. So for some of the supplemental pieces that I was talking about earlier that you can add to your policy, some of those are not going to work for some states. So you want to make sure that you've got coverage that's going to cover you in all the states that you're working in, that you're licensed in, because wherever the claim occurs, if it's virtual, the client is in Tennessee, you're in North Carolina, then likely that claim is going to be brought through Tennessee. So just kind of keep that in mind. Limits of liability. If you have your policy, pull it up now. If you don't, or you're watching this later, just take your time, pull up your policy, and look at what your limits of liability are. The aggregate limit is indicating the maximum for all claims within that particular policy period, which is usually a year. So that might be, I think, typically $3 million. If you have over $3 million, now you're going to be out of pocket for that. Hopefully, no one does. But they're going to, for that first $3 million, cover you within that year for all claims that occur. There's a smaller maximum per claim. I almost said per client per claim. That's typically around $1 million. If you have 3 claims of $1 million each, now you've hit your maximum per claim and your maximum per year. Hopefully, it's very unlikely that we would hit either the 1 million or the 3 million, but it's important for you to know what those aggregate limits are and what they mean. So there's the per claim, which is usually that first number, and then there's the per year policy period amount that you're going to have. And I hope that none of us ever reach those amounts, but just important to know. I think 1 million, 3 million is generally the recommended / required. So if you have less than that, you might want to look at increasing it. I talked earlier about some claims that were coming up to about $500,000 at least. That was an average. So that means there are claims that are higher than $500,000. You want to make sure you have, as much coverage as possible in case something happened. Another question that folks will ask when you're looking at your policy, is it occurrence or claims made? And there's not necessarily one that's better than the other. So this is something you want to talk to that insurance agent about. But occurrence is going to provide coverage for incidents that take place during the covered policy. So if your policy is paid from January to December 2024, if a claim occurs at any time in between those dates in 2024, even if it's reported after that policy date is over, so if it happens in 2024, but it's not reported until 2025, it's going to be covered under the policy for the 2024 year. This can be long-term protection if claims come up much later, that are actually filed much later than when they happened. That might be one positive for having an occurrence-based policy. A claims-made policy provides coverage for claims that happen and are reported to the insurance company while the policy is in force. And sometimes you can extend the reporting period of that, which for any of you who are thinking about retirement, we'll talk about that in a minute. That might be something to consider adding to your coverage. So claims made is for claims that are against you coming from an incident and reported to the insurance company while the policy is in place. If you are looking at retiring, but you're keeping your license, you might ask about tail coverage. And this would cover you past maybe, so if we have that 2024 time period and you retire in 2025, but you keep your license, that tail coverage is going to extend the time frame of when a claim can be reported. The claim will have to have happened while the policy was in place, but the reporting can be extended. Your declarations page is likely what your insurance company sends you when you sign up for a policy and get that coverage in place. It's generally the first page or few pages of your policy. It notes your coverages and your limits. I can't remember which company it was, and I'm not going to call them out anyway, but I got a policy through one of our well-known insurance companies for counselors. And when they sent me the information that, hey, your policy's in force, here's your deck page or declarations page, I was like, can I have my full policy, please? You want to make sure you're getting your full policy. It's going to be tens of pages, 30 pages, 50 pages, something like that. It's going to have all the definitions. So that's going to help you understand what is or isn't a covered claim. It's going to talk about exclusions. So what sort of claims are excluded from your policy? And it'll also have amendments. So these are what I talked about earlier, some of the supplemental pieces. If you are buying back coverage, it's going to be shown as an amendment. So it's going to kind of supersede any exclusion that might have been in there. So for example, If they excluded cyber liability coverage from your policy, but you bought that cyber liability coverage, it will show as an amendment overriding the exclusion of that coverage. You won't find an insurance agent who will tell you every single instance that will or will not be paid for from your policy, because it's impossible. A lot of folks would ask me that as an insurance agent, but what if this? But what if this? But what if this? Every situation is going to be completely different. So just know you are doing your best, working with an agent and finding your coverages and adding anything on that you feel like you need that maybe previously would have been excluded. Yeah, thanks for everyone who's here. If you need to leave, please do. I'll keep chatting. You can always come back if you need to leave. This recording will be up for you to come back and refer to or finish whatever you need. We started to talk a little bit about who needs what type of coverage. So I just want to emphasize some of the points that I made earlier. All of us here are likely clinicians or students. So if you are a clinician, please know if you're employed by someone else that your employer's policy is designed to protect the employer's need and interests. Even if you have your own business and your business has a policy with professional liability coverage, that's to cover your business. It's really important to have your own liability coverage so that if you are named, which you would be, in a claim, then you would have that coverage. Students, if you are an ACA member, you have liability insurance that can be included in paying for that student membership with the American Counseling Association. There may be others that will also offer this, but I know specifically that the ACA does. And if you want that coverage / you want to make sure that coverage is in place, you have to reach out to them and ask for your declarations page or proof of insurance. So if you're an ACA member as a student, you will likely have coverage through the ACA. Double check on that by asking for your deck page or your declarations page or proof of insurance for that. It may be required by some of the sites that you go to for practicum and internship, for example. The other thing to know about student coverage, and this goes for anyone who is bringing on a student as like a supervisee, or if you are a student, or even if any of you here are from education and from some of the universities, students are covered by their own policies while they are registered and the semester is actively ongoing. The school may have coverages for the student no matter when, like in between semesters, during the summer break, whatever. The school may have a policy that covers them, but it's not going to cover the student themselves if they get named in that claim. So same reason why if you're working for someone else, I recommend you have your own policy. If you're a student, I recommend you have your own policy. Already an ACA member, great. Just get that proof of coverage. If not, there are other companies who will likely give you a discounted rate for being a student. Make sure that you're reading what the policy says, like in the ACA, the last time I checked anyway. It says the coverage is in place while the student is actively enrolled in courses, meaning you are registered and the semester is happening. That's what that means. Otherwise, outside of that, you may not be covered if something happened. Like, let's say in between 2 semesters, you were seeing clients, something happened with a client, you may not be covered during that time. That goes for the student and for you as the supervisor or the owner of the business. So be careful with that. If you're a supervisor, just make sure that you know what your risks are. And if you want to require supervisees to have their own policies, I think that's a great protection for yourself. But for you as a supervisor, make sure your duties listed in your policy include supervision. It's not just going to automatically include that if you go get a professional liability policy. Even if you note that you're a supervisor, it may not include that. So make sure that that is a duty that is checked or included in your policy. If you're a boss, definitely recommend that you have anyone you're employing have their own policies to prevent any gaps in coverage that could happen. Usually, this is another question that I get asked in like Facebook groups. What if you have like a new employee? Like, are they covered in that policy? Usually, yes. What they might do is, I think some of the larger companies anyway will usually just say, "Hey, how many employees do you have when you're applying for the coverage? How many employees do you have? What activities do they do?" And then that creates your policy and your premium. Then every renewal, they ask again, "Hey, how many employees do you have? What activities are they doing? Here's your new premium and renewal." Usually, you don't have to list them out individually. Usually, if you get a new employee, they are automatically included, but that's why you want your full policy documents to make sure that that is the case. Make sure that is how your coverage is defined, and ask that insurance agent about your policy and how that works. If you're a business owner, this goes for those of us who are PLLCs or LLCs or S corps, or PA, professional associations. And if you are a sole proprietor doing business under a DBA, doing business as, if you fall under any of those categories, then that business entity would also need to be insured. Many policies that we have through our typical national well-known companies for clinicians, you can add some limited business coverage to that. So that may be a great alternative for you. Maybe it's a decent premium, you don't mind, it's just you. So it's like, okay, it's me, it's the business, we're good. If you're growing beyond that, then you may want to look at getting in contact with an insurance agent, which I'll come back. I think there's a question about that. If you are leasing space, then you want to make sure you have workplace liability coverage. Helps with injuries, damages that occur at the workplace, legal liability caused by fire and water. If you own the place, we've talked about that, just making sure you have the right coverages there, and then have anyone who's renting from you have that particular coverage, workplace liability extension coverage. And then add you as the business owner, the building owner, as like an additional insured or a named insured, depending upon your policy, the way that they describe it. If you're retiring, just make sure if you keep your license active, you get that tail coverage for your policy. So that's something you'll have to ask an agent about. As long as you have your license, you could be held liable for any advice that you give, any place that you volunteer, anytime you might be in a situation with emergency type care that you step in and provide. Some insurance companies will have specific coverage for retirement or even leave of absence. So if you are taking, anyone in here is taking a leave of absence, there is sometimes a leave of absence discount that could include family leave, changing to non-healthcare occupation, retirement, disability. It's limited coverage, just keep that in mind, but it can be a much lower premium as long as you still have that license. So where do you find an insurance agent? Any recommended companies? If you're a small business, I would recommend talking to other small businesses in your area about what insurance agents they use, what companies they use. There are independent insurance agents who work with multiple companies, and they often work with restaurants. I know that because I worked in an independent agent office, and one of our top clients was restaurants. So they typically know what's up when it comes to independent agents. That might be something to ask. As far as companies that are directly related to our field, there are a few that I will put. I don't necessarily recommend any of them, but there are a few that you can talk to that I think a lot of us know of. So you've got HPSO. They have really great resources on risk management, which is where I got some of the information from today. So if you're interested, even if you don't get insurance with them, check out their resources. Really great. They have case studies. They have checklists for risk management. They are one of the ones who just came out with the most recent report that was a combination between them, the CNA insurances, and ACA. They came out with that report, and then they also come up with sub reports. So this year, I'm excited to see their sub report on supervisors and bosses. Let's see. The CNA insurances, that is someone else um, who does for us as mental health professionals. So just look for the healthcare in the industries, look for healthcare. I think they're a group of insurance companies. So they are kind of like an insurance agent that will likely find like something specific to your state and to your situation. I'll go ahead and put in the that healthcare industries. The trust is another one. This is often for psychologists. So that might be something to check out. I'm not sure if they've expanded to other types of mental health professionals, but those are the top three I usually see with regards to the insurance companies that people use. You can go into many of the social media groups and ask who people use. I think you're likely going to see the HPSO, CNA, and trust insurance pop up as some of the key ones that people use. But I'm sure there's others that I haven't thought of. Sometimes your national or state bodies, like accrediting bodies, your boards, if you have professional representation organizations, they may have some sort of working relationship with insurance companies. So they may be one to go to and ask who they recommend. Can you get a discount? Things like that. That would be like the American Counseling Association, National Association of Social Work. I think they are aligned with some insurance companies. Your board likely won't recommend anyone specific, but if you have any sort of associations for your license type in your state, they may have a connection, recommendation, or discount, something along those lines. So, um, that's how you can kind of start the process. I'm not going to say I recommend any of these companies one or the over the other. I think it really depends upon your relationship with them, the coverage that you want, if they offer it, stuff like that. So definitely check them out. Run the quote simulator and find out what your premium would look like through each one, what the coverages are that you can add. Talk to them. I mean, really, you want to talk to them before something happens, right? So that you already have that relationship built up. And I think that's why an independent agent can be really helpful, especially for those of us who are business owners, because we can build that relationship with them. One of the examples, I'll keep talking. Y'all feel free to put comments, questions in the chat. One of the examples that I saw when I was searching through the case studies sounds like someone who was doing work through one of the big corporations that are doing like online um, therapy, maybe through text, phone calls, messages. Of course, the kind of video conferencing that we're maybe more used to. But some of them also will help you get paneled with insurance, and all of those types of companies. I won't name any. You know who they are. They will usually have their own platform. And the platform is typically where these services take place. So the messaging that might take place, the video conferencing that might take place. Um, they might have the like a client list in their own platform, things like that. It's not enough to keep your information in their platform. There was a case where someone assumed that that was okay, that they could just keep all that communication in there. They didn't need to take any additional notes, so on and so forth. They did have a claim related to that, because they were not tracking their progress with the client appropriately. They didn't have that treatment plan in place. They didn't have a full assessment in place. They didn't have progress notes. And I think we can sit here and be like, gosh, like, why didn't they think of that? But if we are trusting another company or a platform, it's easy to get pulled into that, right? So I just recommend that regardless like of what platform you're using, make sure that you have a copy somewhere, that you're being really thorough about your consent process, the treatment plan and assessment process, as well as progress notes, termination notes, things along those lines. Our best risk management, I think, approach is documentation of everything. So there are some in the HPSO resources, information on documentation, best practices, and a check like a risk management checklist. So definitely, if you haven't done that recently, recommend that you do something along those lines. I think the new report, the third version, is going to come out with like a new separate like sub document on documentation. So definitely recommend that. Sure. So, talking about policies, how long they're effective, and the claims that can happen. So, most of the time, I think the policies you're going to see are annual policies. So they're not going to be specifically from like July 1 to December 31st. It's going to be what day did you buy the policy and what day did it go in place. So if it was today, June 17th, 2025 to June 17th, 2026 is likely going to be your policy period if you were to buy a policy today. Um, Depending upon how your policy is set up with claims, if it's occurrence or claims made, is going to determine when the claim is made or when the claim happens as to which policy period it falls under. So if you have that occurrence based, then and you have this year, so 6/17/2025, 6/17/2026, and there's a claim that happens in between those 2 days during that year, regardless of when the claim is reported, a year down the road, 2027, whatever it might be, that policy period will be what covers that claim. So if you change your coverages between this policy and next policy, but the claim occurs during this policy period, it's going to be under this policy's coverages, which I think is maybe not exactly the question you asked, but is a very good point to make. If you change what your coverages are, it's effective right when it's effective. It's not before. It's going to be effective that day, sometimes that minute. Often our forms with insurance would include the date and the minute that we put it in place. So just keep that in mind. If you don't have cyber liability coverage, you're adding it today. Likely that's going to be effective from today until the end of your policy period, and then your next policy period if you renew with that coverage. If you have claims made coverage, this is going to be the claim when it is filed, is going to be when you that particular policy in place at that time when the claim is filed, not when it occurs, but when it is filed, those coverages come into place. So it's the reverse of what I just said. If, let's say, you didn't have cyber liability, but you put it in place today, and you have a claims made policy, and in 2 weeks someone makes a claim, but it's about 4 weeks ago, because you put the coverage in place and it's claims made, likely it will cover back then. But it's really going to depend upon your policy and the effective dates and things like that. But occurrence is covering when the claim occurred. Claims made is covering when the claim was made, if that makes any sense. So when did the incident occur? If it's occurrence, the policy that was in place when it occurred is what will cover it. If it's claims made, it's whatever policy is in place when the claim is made. I hope that helps. But that might be why, if you have claims made, you might want that extended reporting period, because it's very possible that a claim is made after the policy is over. And also important, like if you're taking a leave of absence, if you're retiring, but you're keeping your license in place, that's why it's so important to still have coverage in place. I hope that made sense. I know it's a little confusing. The key is really knowing what coverage your policy has, so you know the best way to put coverage in place. The hope is, as soon as we get our license, we put coverage in place, and so we're covered from there until we don't have coverage, essentially. But you really want to know what your policy says, so you know when a claim is made, you'll know which policy period that claim will actually go against, which policy period. Can you have both occurrence and claims made? Likely not. Like there may be some, to your point, there may be some types of coverages in the policy that are one or the other, but your policy as a whole is likely going to be one kind or the other. So there may be some supplemental types of coverages that you add on, or amendments. So you want to read those forms really well to know. That's a good question. And that's why I say having that full policy copy is really important, because you want to know, what do those forms say? If it's an exclusion form, what is it saying? What does it mean? If it's an amendment, if you're adding something back, what does that say? What does that mean? It's important for us, even if we can't like read the document in legal terms, like we can't legally interpret it, it's still important for us to know what coverage is in our policy. And then, of course, talk to an insurance agent about, what does this say? What does this mean? If this happens, would it fall under this? Or if this happens, what coverage should I add before that happens, not after the fact? Yeah, good questions. If your board has this publicly available, you might check out complaints that were made to the board, what decisions were made. This could give you an idea of what your board is expecting of you. This is where literally their rules and regulations and codes are being interpreted based upon each individual incidents. So if your board has listed the complaints, I would highly recommend go through them and see what are some of the common complaints that are being made, what happens when that type of complaint happens, like what sort of decision is made by the board. Can give you some insight into risk management strategies. How can you prevent that from happening? What code of ethics are you being held to? If you don't already know that, likely your board has noted at least one code of ethics that you're being held to. If you have multiple licenses, multiple certifications like I do, then you are likely being held to multiple codes of ethics. Some of them may have different requirements. Like, for example, some of them may say, oh, you only need to keep records for 3 years. Some may say 7 years. Some could say 14 years. So you're going to want to go with whichever code of ethics or policy or rule from your board is most stringent. In that case, if I had those 3 different codes or requirements, I would just keep everyone for 14 years just to make sure that I'm adhering to whatever those codes are. Yeah, through make sure that I talked about all my important pieces. I will, since we're talking about it and you've had questions, I'll put in the link to one of the articles on claims made versus occurrence. So you'll likely see a lot of what I talked about, but that may give you some more insight into those two different types. Business interruption coverage, look at what is excluded for that, maybe more so what is included, but also what is excluded. As we come up on hurricane season, I'm thinking about for myself, what happens if I have some sort of interruption in my business because of the weather? Would that be covered under the business interruption? And again, that deductible is likely going to be some sort of hours or days. So it may be 24 hours, 48 hours. Sometimes it's longer. So just kind of keep that in mind. But it did look like some of the policies would include the business interruption if you were injured or ill, if you couldn't work for any particular reason, then that might be a good coverage that I don't think a lot of us talk about. If you're a supervisor or a manager and you're not having these discussions with your supervisees or your employees, I think now is the time to talk to them about what are their coverages, ask for a copy of their declarations page, ask if you can be listed on their policy. Make sure that you're having that discussion now before something happens. Make sure they have appropriate coverage, that they understand what the coverage is. We're not taught this in our programs, right? So just making sure that we are learning ourselves as supervisors and managers, but then we're also talking to employees and supervisees and maybe even colleagues about what all this entails. Look at your insurance contracts. If you're paneled with insurance companies, they may have a requirement for your insurance coverages. And I'm thinking at the very least what your minimum limits of liability need to be. Often those are the 1 million, 3 million limits, but just check your insurance panels and go with whichever one is most stringent if they have a higher amount. If you have questions or concerns about it, you've got my email there, admin@ccresourcing.us. You can reach out at any time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Just remember that I am no longer a licensed insurance agent, so I can't give you any legal advice. I can only give you Dana's opinion. Um, I am not your supervisor. I'm not your boss. So you really need to do your own research and talk to someone who can interpret this like an insurance agent. I'm happy to share my opinion all day, every day, but really make sure that you're getting the information from someone who can talk to you about it. So if you are running out and calling your insurance companies right now, make sure you're talking to a licensed insurance agent who's licensed in your state, not just a representative. And be patient. They may need to contact you back if they don't have someone who's licensed in your state available right away. My plan is, if this looks like it meets that threshold, that I can be able to offer it for NBCC CEs. So if you're interested in that, please reach out and let us know, and we can tell you when it's available. That's the hope. Hope that this meets that threshold. I really appreciate y'all being here, whether you're here live or you're here on demand. I enjoy talking on and on about various topics. So if you want to hear more about this, if you want to do another training or discussion around liability insurance, so not insurance paneling, but liability insurance, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about that and maybe answer some of your additional questions or review some board complaints. Those are always fun. Whatever works for y'all. Just appreciate you being here, and look forward to talking with you soon. Thanks so much.